All right.
Hey, welcome everybody. Welcome to our very first of our stream sessions as part of the Missouri Stream Team Academy. We're very grateful that you could join us tonight on a Thursday evening for our very first stream session. Tonight covering common snakes of Missouri streams. Joining us as panelists and also alternative hosts that will help to answer questions in the chat. And again, for folks that have just joined us, if you can direct your questions to the chat box, that would be wonderful. We have Jenna Steek, who is the stream team coordinating biologist for the Southeast region and part of our volunteer water quality monitoring program. And Kat Lackman, who is a stream team coordinating biologist for the Ozark and Southwest regions. Myself, Amy Meyer, I am the coordinating biologist for the Missouri River Unit, or Northern Missouri. And tonight we have Sam Daugherty, who is joining us from the Volunteer Water Quality Monitoring Program. He has been with us with the stream team program for the last year and a half or so, and has a pretty varied background, especially in plant identification, crayfish sampling, restoration, working with bats in caves as well. So very diverse background in stream ecology and biology, and of course has had an interest in snakes and reptiles since he was a kid, like many of us have had. So we really appreciate Sam coming to us tonight and for the continuing presentations that we'll be giving through November for snakes, turtles, wildflowers, and invasive plants. So with that, I will let Sam take it away.
All right. Thank you, Amy, and thank you again for organizing these presentations. Sure, it was not nearly as fun as finding hundreds of snake pictures. So as you heard, I'm not a herpetologist by trade, but I have had a very long-standing interest or passion in reptiles, especially snakes. Pretty much ever since I could read, I've been staring at reptile guides and snake books and going out and catching snakes and trying to identify them, much to the shock of my mother, obviously. Another reason why I wanted to do this is because, well, anyone who spent a lot of time around Missouri streams, whether it's swimming or fishing or canoeing, it's pretty impossible not to see a snake. And most people, they have some opinion of snakes, whether it's positive or negative. Some people, usually the minority, like them, like me. But most people, they're generally more towards the spectrum of fear or outright hatred, give the creeps. So I kind of wanted to do this presentation to, I guess, educate both the nature lovers who really appreciate snakes and want to learn about them, and then also the people who are kind of afraid of snakes and maybe want to learn more about them to assuage their fears or concerns of getting outdoors. So another good reason why I wanted to do this presentation, especially now, is that early fall is actually a pretty good time to see snakes. I think most people, they associate reptiles with really warm temperatures like the middle of summer, but actually the average noon temperatures around fall are pretty ideal for snakes, whereas midsummer, when it's in the 90s, midday, most snakes are actually taking shelter because that's just too hot for them. So much like us, they really do like somewhat milder weather, usually in the 70s or 80s. And because of that, they're often basking at the times of day when we are out as well, which is midday. Whereas during the summer, they tend to be more nocturnal or crepuscular, coming out at dusk and dawn. Another reason why they're very visible this time of year is because snakes are hatching or being born around late summer. So there's lots of little baby snakes everywhere to see. Despite that, snakes do actually breed in spring like most animals, but because they're cold-blooded, it takes their embryos a much longer amount of time to fully develop. usually around 2 or 3 months to incubate, whereas, say, a bird usually only takes 3 or 4 weeks just because it's being warmed up by its mother's body, so it gets to develop faster. Another reason why snakes are pretty visible this time of year is because many of them are starting to move to their winter dens. So snakes don't technically hibernate. It's called brumation. So they have to seek out a safe place below the frost line because they can't really tolerate freezing. And they just kind of hunker up and they lower their metabolism and they just kind of sit there and relax for 2, 3, 4 months. They do move around somewhat very slowly. They can kind of change their position if they're a little too cold or too warm. But often there's a scarcity of really high quality hibernaculums or winter dens for snakes. So they do have to travel some distances over land, and that makes them pretty visible this time of year. So I'm assuming most people know what a snake is, obviously. They're reptiles. They're most closely related to lizards. They're carnivorous, although there is one YouTube video of a snake out there trying to eat grapes. Didn't do very well. They're ectothermic. Obviously, being reptiles, they're cold-blooded. Their body temperature is dictated by the ambient air temperature, so they can't generate their own warmth. Being reptiles, they are scaly. They have scales covering their entire body. Scales are made of keratin, just like feathers and hair. And snakes, unlike other reptiles, they actually use their scales to help them with locomotion. So all snakes have, well, the majority of land-dwelling snakes have these really large belly plates, and that just, they use those to kind of grip and pull themselves along the ground. As everyone knows, snakes shed their skin like most reptiles, but they do it in one big piece. As you can see on this one, they even shed the outside of their eye, so they don't have eyelids. It's just covered by a transparent scale called a spectacle, and that all just gets shed in one big piece. As far as their whole body, morphology, anatomy, they're pretty simple, at least skeletally. A snake is pretty much just a skull, which is very loosely articulated. It's made of lots of little small pieces that are loosely connected. One really long spine made of 100 or 200 vertebrae, with most of those vertebrae having a pair of ribs, and that's about it. And their organs are much the same as other vertebrates, except they're very elongate, obviously, to fit in that body cavity. They actually only have one lung, which is pretty weird. All right. So snakes of Missouri. Missouri actually has quite a few different species of snakes. 47 or so species or subspecies. That changes now and again with taxonomy and genetics work. They're pretty diverse, more diverse than any other group of reptile in the state. They are found in pretty much all habitats: glades, forests, prairies, wetlands, streams. But many do live kind of near aquatic habitats, so streams, swamps, creeks, things like that. One reason for that is, well, obviously aquatic habitats tend to support more diversity in general. You know, obviously think of animals gathering around the water hole. One, they need water, obviously. Two, there's often a lot of vegetation, so cover, shade, things like that. They're often those kinds of habitats, those riparian forests, those forests growing along streams. They provide shelter, both for forest-dwelling snakes that are kind of living out in prairie regions, as well as regions that are now heavily agricultural. These kinds of riparian corridors offer really crucial habitat and shelter for snakes to live in and move around in an environment that's been heavily transformed by people. This also applies in urban settings as well, as urban streams tend to be the most continuously forested areas within cities, and that's really the only available habitat there is often. And also, they're just often very complex habitats with lots of fallen trees and vegetation, places to hide in, as well as a lot of good sunny areas to bask, which is good because they're cold-blooded and obviously they need to sit in the sun and warm up to become metabolically active. But really the main thing that attracts snakes to aquatic habitats like streams is the abundance of prey. And their prey is very, very abundant in these aquatic habitats. The most important is probably amphibians. There's a lot of snakes here and around the world that actually specialize in eating amphibians, just because they are also very abundant and they're pretty easy to eat. So here that's going to include things like frogs, cricket frogs, leopard frogs, bullfrogs, as well as toads, which is pretty interesting because the few snakes that can eat toads are pretty much the only animals that do, because toads are poisonous. They have toxins in their skin, which actually stop the heart of any animal that eats them. This also includes aquatic salamanders and, of course, tadpoles, which seasonally are very abundant and they're very easy for snakes to catch and consume. Obviously, if you're living in an aquatic environment, it's helpful to eat fish. They're present as well, and many snakes do. If you didn't know that, snakes eat fish. And there are actually some that are very specialized. None that occur here, though. In Missouri, fish that are going to be targeted by snakes in Missouri streams are going to be things like darters, mainly being attacked by very small snakes or juveniles. Sculpins, which are pretty slow and easy to catch, especially at night when they're catfish, small catfish usually. Cyprinids like minnows, small sunfish, things like that. And of course, rodents, which are present in pretty much every habitat there is as well. They're obviously prey. That's generally what people think of when someone asks them what do snakes eat. Well, mice. But yeah, their diets are much more diverse than rodents. They also eat eggs, nestling birds. Turtle eggs are often a very important food for some snakes. They'll just sit next to a turtle as she's laying her eggs and wait for her to leave and then swallow them all whole. Also, interestingly, a lot of snakes eat invertebrates. So there are a few snakes that actually specialize in eating crayfish, which is pretty unusual. We have at least one species in Missouri. There's many that eat arthropods, like insects, spiders. So something like a dragonfly that's emerging out of the water to molt its last time and become an adult. It's in a very vulnerable state because it's taking hours to dry out its exoskeleton. Meant to be a very easy meal for a snake. Worms and leeches are eaten by a couple different species of snakes, especially small ones, and even snails. Across the world, there are snail specialists eating snakes, and we have some that in Missouri that like eating snails too. Despite being predators, snakes are also pretty important prey animals for a lot of different species. The act of eating snakes is called ophiophagy. The animals that eat snakes would be considered ophiophagous. So they're kind of serving as important links between those smaller animals that we just talked about and then larger animals in the food chain that eat them. They are pretty popular food items just because they're generally pretty abundant, and when they're not venomous, they're pretty easy to catch and dispatch. So obviously, when people think of snake-eating animals, one of the first things that comes to mind is things like a red-tailed hawk, seen in the center picture. Eat a lot of snakes in the summer, as do red-shouldered hawks, which are a close relative. In the bottom left, in fact, they actually prefer lowland forests near water. That's their favorite habitat, and they eat a lot of snakes. As do species of owls, like the barred owl, which also occur in those habitats, as well as things like screech owls and great horned owls. And obviously, wading birds, like the great blue heron on the right, will readily consume snakes as well. Mammals are another major predator. Possums not only eat lots of snakes, but they're actually immune to some pit viper venom, so they can actually eat copperheads. Otters, they don't just eat fish, they will eat other vertebrates, including snakes. Skunks, they will eat small snakes when they're digging around in the dirt for various food items. Raccoons are another major predator, especially because they forage a lot in riparian areas, as most people know. And even mammals as small as shrews. They will readily consume small snakes. They are venomous, they're carnivorous, and they have a really high metabolism. They'll eat anything they can overpower. There's a pretty cool video of a shrew eating a garter snake that's much larger than itself. So some large turtles, especially snapping turtles, they will readily eat snakes. Seen some videos of it. Seems like a very slow and painful process. Large bullfrogs, they can actually turn the tables on snakes and they will eat young ones. Some large carnivorous fish, like largemouth bass, sometimes they have snakes in their stomach. And even some large aquatic salamanders, like hellbenders, they will occasionally eat snakes. There was a really cool picture in National Geographic issue a few months or years ago of Ozark or eastern hellbender in the Appalachian Mountains chomping down on a pretty big water snake, which was news to me. I didn't know they did that. But and last but not least, there's actually a lot of snakes that eat other snakes. There are Ophiophagous snakes in Missouri. Those include the speckled king snake on the top left. It's a very handsome snake, as well as things like the yellow-bellied racer on the right, and even the venomous cottonmouth will eat other snakes. So you can see a picture on the bottom. All right, so the main part of this presentation will be going through a short list of different snake species that are both common and widespread in Missouri and that often occur in or near stream habitats. I made it a pretty short list because no one wants to listen to a list of 20 or 30 things and hear a sentence or two about them. That's kind of boring. So I chose 10 or 11 species that are probably the most common, so you have the most chance of coming upon them in or near these kinds of places. And it's also a pretty diverse list, so it kind of gives you a good sample of what the snake diversity is in this state as well. So the main one is probably one of the most common. I'm sure everyone's seen it. They're pretty hard to miss. Is the northern water snake. So it occurs statewide, and you can find it in not just stream habitats, but pretty much any aquatic habitat, really. Ponds, swamps, things like that. And it's a very widely distributed species in North America. It occurs as far north, actually, as southern Canada. Interestingly enough, despite being one of 5 or 6 species of water snake that occur within Missouri, it's actually the only water snake in the Ozarks. So has kind of a monopoly there. Not sure why exactly. It could just be something about colder water that puts the other snakes at a disadvantage. Most of the other water snake species, which are in the genus Nerodia, in Missouri, they tend to prefer warmer, stiller water. So most of the diversity is in the southeast region, kind of in the Boot Heel, where most of our swamps were historically. It's a pretty easy snake to see. They're pretty conspicuous because they're basking a lot throughout the day, probably because they're constantly losing heat to the cold water they're swimming in. So if you paddle down a river, you have a pretty good chance of seeing them trying to warm up on a log sticking out of the water, much like a turtle. And they have a pretty long activity period as well. They're fairly cold tolerant, as you would imagine a snake that can live in Canada would be. You can see them pretty much from late March into November, and sometimes even on warm winter days. I've seen one cruising around on a warm day in like late December. That was quite a surprise. So as far as the description goes, they're about a medium-sized snake, 2-4 feet long, generally not too big. Their scales are what you'd call keeled, so it just has a raised edge or a raised center, and that makes them very rough to the touch. The coloration is pretty variable, but it's generally some shade of brown with darker brown or sometimes reddish markings. The markings towards the neck are a little more triangular in shape. They kind of look like little saddles, which is what they're usually referred to, and that kind of transitions down the body into these large blotches on top along the spine with these vertical rectangular markings along the flanks. And the belly has pretty distinctive markings. It's usually somewhat of a double row of little half moons or half circles, but to see that, obviously, you'd probably have to have either a dead snake or a snake in your hand, so not the most useful identification tool. This picture is mainly just to show you that colorations are not always that visible, especially in reptiles. So as snakes age, often their colors become a little more muted. Also, when they're dry, their color patterns and their colors are not as easy to see as when you're swimming around in the water. So if this snake jumped in the water, which it probably did a few seconds after this picture was taken, probably looked much more colorful than it is. And much like water turtles, these snakes are often covered with a layer of mud, which can further obscure their pattern. Just to make things trickier, the babies look a little different than the adults, and that's very true for a lot of different snake species. Newborns mostly are the ones that look different. They generally have a kind of paler ground color with much darker, almost black markings. So they have a lot more contrast to them. As you can see in these two pictures, the left picture is actually one I took this weekend on the Katy Trail. Little newborn crawling around. But once they're about a year old or so, by their next year, they kind of develop the usual adult colors and patterns, as you can see in this individual. So those baby colors, they don't really last that long. And I should mention that there is a subspecies of northern water snake called the Midland water snake. It's really just a southern form of it. So the water snakes occur at the southern edge of their distribution. So places like southern Missouri, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, they tend to look like this. They're much paler. Sometimes they're almost orange. This is a pretty extreme example. And their bands and spots are almost a reddish color. So they're a little more handsome sometimes than the northern water snakes, but everything else about them is identical. All right, so feeding habits. Obviously, as you can see in this picture, they do eat fish. They also eat a lot of amphibians. They swallow their prey alive, whole, as most snakes do. They don't constrict it, and they're not venomous, obviously. So they pretty much just grab it, overpower it, and gulp it down. As you can see in this picture, northern water snake has captured a sculpin at the mouth of a cave. This one looks like some sort of minnow or cyprinid. Here's a bluegill. They can't eat small sunfish. And this one's a pretty cool picture. I think that might be a gizzard shad or something similar that it's eating. But you can really see what snakes are capable of in terms of swallowing prey alive. And they're capable of doing that for multiple reasons. For one, they don't actually have a chin. So their mandible, their lower jaw, it's not fused in the middle. The only thing connecting it is some stretchy connective tissue. So their lower jaw can actually spread outwards. And then the joints that connect their lower and upper jaw are very flexible as well. So then they can open their mouth at around 160 to 100 degree angle. And the components or the parts of their skull is made of multiple different pieces that are loosely connected, and they can kind of stretch them out and move them independently to kind of walk their head over their prey items. And another thing that helps them is their skin, especially around their neck. It's incredibly stretchy. So if you look really closely at this picture, you can actually see the skin in between the individual scales as it's engulfing that huge fish. And again, amphibians are also a very important prey item. Just very abundant in aquatic habitats. Snakes don't always eat their prey head first, especially when it's not very dangerous prey. So the frog can't really do anything to hurt the snake, whereas, say, a mouse could easily bite off an eye. I don't think that frog looks quite phased enough, in my opinion. It looks a little too relaxed. All right, so water snakes and many other snakes are actually what you call sexually dimorphic. So the males and females don't look quite the same. There's some difference about them. In water snakes, the females are fairly larger than the males. The main reason for that is probably because they can carry more offspring that way. So a larger female, she's able to produce more offspring, both because she can hold more fat bodies to nourish them and create them, as well as just having more body cavity space to store them. This behavior of multiple water snakes basking together is really not that unusual. For one, they're just not a very territorial species. They're not known to be cannibalistic like some snakes, so they do tolerate quite well. And like turtles, there's probably a lot of congregation around the best basking sites around riversides. But what might be happening here is that this picture could have been taken in spring, and that's their mating season. And when that happens, multiple males will often follow a single female, and she will usually mate with multiple males as well in the breeding season. And her brood will be fathered often by multiple fathers. This is what snake mating looks like, pretty much just curling their tails around each other. You can also see the larger female on the right, small male on the left. Most snakes that are sexually dimorphic, they are sexually dimorphic that way. Females love being larger than males, but there are a few exceptions. And they actually give live birth. So if you're under the impression that all reptiles lay eggs, then you probably have a high school biology teacher that owes you an apology. There are actually a lot of snakes and even many lizards that give birth live, as well as many fish too, including sharks. They don't do this quite the same way as mammals do. It is kind of still the same as laying an egg. So each individual offspring is contained within a very thin egg membrane. It just doesn't have a shell because they don't need one, because they're safe and warm and moist inside their mother's oviduct. And they are nourished primarily by a yolk, just like any other animal in an egg, whereas a placental mammal is being nourished primarily directly through a blood connection with its mother. However, there are some reptiles that do maintain some level of transference of nutrients between mother and offspring, but it's usually somewhat limited in most species. As far as the number of offspring in water snakes, they make a lot. Average is usually 2 or 3 dozen, but it can be as much as 60 in really large, older females. The reason for that is that baby water snakes are just really easy and good to eat. So if you can make more offspring, you have more chance of passing on your genes into the next generation, because chances are most of them are going to get eaten. And if you've noticed that this snake looks a little different than the other ones I've showed you, it's actually a different species of water snake called the diamondback water snake. Different pattern, but similar species. It's just a really good picture. Northern water snakes are the same. Obviously, being a water snake, they're a very good swimmer. They will dive often, both to escape from predators and to forage around for prey, like small fish on the bottom. That can actually be a distinguishing behavioral trait to distinguish them from cottonmouths, but we'll kind of get into that later. Interestingly enough, they really don't have any physical adaptations towards an aquatic lifestyle. And that's true of a lot of semi-aquatic snakes. There's really nothing about them that gives them any real advantage towards living in water as opposed to any terrestrial snake. So morphologically, they're pretty much the same. It's really just all behavioral adaptations. So they just seek out aquatic environments just simply because that's where the most prey is. So there's kind of this ongoing, I don't know if you call it a myth, but people say you can always identify a venomous snake from a non-venomous snake by the shape of its head, because venomous snakes have these wide triangular heads. And that is kind of true, but also sometimes not. What they're referring to there is mainly the large, wide heads of pit vipers, things like rattlesnakes and cottonmouths that have huge venom glands on the sides of their heads. But outside of North America and maybe Europe, that's not true at all. And even here, snakes, when they're agitated, they will try to make themselves look as big as possible. One way they do that is just by puffing up. So they spread their ribs, they inflate their one lung to look as big as possible. Then they can also spread their head. As we've seen, their head is very flexible. They can stretch it out. So they're trying to look as big as possible, and maybe secondarily also looking more like a venomous snake. So it's trying to discourage someone or something from attacking or disturbing it. Normally when they're disturbed, they're just going to swim away, slither away, get into the water, dive, get as far away from you as possible. But when that's not possible, like what probably happened in this picture, someone came upon the snake. It was in the open, probably on a gravel road. The snake knew it couldn't get away in time, so it instead formed a defensive posture. It curled up and puffed up to look dangerous. But really, if a snake was doing this, if you stepped backwards a few feet, it would probably just make a run for it and leave. Water snakes, in total, the whole genus Neurodia, they have quite a reputation for being pretty pugnacious when you try to handle them or mess with them. So they will flail around wildly, they will bite you, and they will defecate and release a horrible smelling musk, a lot like a skunk, and they will rub it in your fresh bite wounds. I learned that from a very young age. So I wouldn't really call it aggressive because you kind of have to bother the snake to elicit that response. But yeah, they can be pretty ornery. Some scientists think the reason for that is because they have so many predators in these aquatic environments that they have to be a little extra mean just to give them a better chance of getting away. But if general, like all snakes. Yep.
System, we do have a question in the Q&A
Sure.
that I was actually able to see. Can snakes ever bite off more than they can chew, so to speak, and regurgitate or give up on too large of a meal?
Yeah, that does happen. So sometimes it can just be, yeah, the animal was a little too big. I know I've seen some examples of that. Can't pull any to mind.
I have. I worked in the pet store. and yes, they do regurgitate their meals.
And sometimes prey animals can turn the tables on snakes as well. So a lot of people, like in the pet trade, they'll feed live mice to snakes. Sometimes that can actually be dangerous in a close environment like a terrarium. Because that mouse, I mean, it does have pretty serious incisors. And if it wants to bite the snake, and if it has that opportunity, it can inflict pretty serious injury. And there are some snakes, especially like constrictors, which have to have a lot of close contact with prey. They often have scars and bite marks and things like that. And I actually just saw a picture a few hours ago of a king cobra that tried to eat a small reticulated python, and it envenomated it, but the python wrapped around the cobra and strangled it to death, and then the python died of the venom, so they were both found dead. So yeah, that can't happen. That's always a risk, really, with any predator going after dangerous prey. But yeah, sometimes snakes will try to bite off a little more than they can chew and give up. I think here's a disclaimer I should put in. In general, it's best to leave snakes alone, obviously. You don't want to handle snakes, especially if you don't know what they are. That said, here's a picture of me holding a snake. This was taken in fall a few years ago by Perchie Creek. I just put it in there to kind of show you the color pattern, as well as the texture of the scales. You can really see how rough they are in this picture, as well as kind of give you a sense of scale. So that was probably a young individual or maybe a male. Not as big as they can get, but pretty average size. On the right is a picture of a water snake wrapped in some sort of plastic filament. So this can happen sometimes with fishing line as well. And a lot of snakes that get caught in like plastic erosion control mesh. That happens sometimes. A few years ago, my sister sent me a picture of a rat snake that was caught in one. She didn't know what it was. She wanted me to identify it so she could cut it out. But yeah, sometimes litter can be a problem. Although at least they don't have limbs to get caught. All right, so the next species I want to talk about is the eastern garter snake. It's actually closely related to water snakes. They're in the same subfamily, Natricinae, in the family Colubridae. They're a pretty common snake. They're statewide in Missouri. Again, they're found like throughout the eastern half of North America, so from the eastern Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic coast and Florida all the way to like Alberta and Manitoba, I think, in Canada. So a lot of people call them garden snakes or garter snakes. While that would probably be a better name for them since they're often found in gardens. The actual name is garter snake, an R and a T. And they're just named after, I guess, the garters that people used to wear to hold up their socks that at the time were striped. I've never worn a garter. But again, they're pretty common in gardens. They're probably the most common suburban snake in most of eastern, even western North America, really. They do pretty well with development. And again, they occur in a lot of habitat. They tend to prefer areas near water. They do swim well. Most of their prey lives in or near water as well. They're good swimmers, pretty much like any snake. Cool thing about a snake's body plan is it's so versatile. So they can pretty much all swim. They can all slither, climb, burrow. So while they might not be able to do any of those as well as, say, anything with limbs, the fact that they can do all of them without limbs is still pretty impressive. Here's another picture. And yeah, just to reiterate, a very common snake in suburbs. Chances are if you see a snake in a really suburban area, it's probably this one. I grew up in St. Louis, and this was the snakes. These were the snakes that we had in our backyard, even though we were living in a huge suburban area. As far as description goes, they're about the same size as water snakes, 2-4 feet long. The most distinctive thing about them is their stripes, which is how they got the name. They have 3 stripes. They're usually yellow. They have 1 down their spine, vertebral stripe, and then 2, 1 on either side. And their scales are also kind of rough to the touch, just like water snakes as well. Aside from that, they are somewhat variable. So they vary both across their wide distribution, but even within a population, you do get a lot of variation in color and color pattern. So sometimes they can be a little more brown, sometimes they're jet black. They often have a checker pattern between their stripes to some degree. The ones I'd find in my backyard were pretty cool. Like they had an alternating pattern of orange and white spots instead of just black checkerboards, which is pretty interesting. I've never seen that anywhere else. And in western Missouri, we have a subspecies called the red-sided garter snake, which always has red pigment in between its scales. So feeding habits, they're pretty similar to water snakes, but probably more emphasis on things like amphibians as well as some invertebrates. They swallow them alive, just like water snakes. However, their saliva has been found to contain some mild neurotoxins, which are thought to help kind of immobilize their amphibian prey. They're still not venomous. They're not dangerous to people. Some people have very mild reactions to garter snake bites, but it's usually just itching, minor swelling. I've been bitten by them a lot as a child. Never really amounted to anything. But again, amphibians are probably the most important prey item. Frogs, salamanders, toads, fish, invertebrates, and we'll kind of go over that. So this one, I think it's actually a western species of garter snake. It's eating some sort of salmonid, so probably a trout. They can't eat fish. With people who try to have little fish ponds in their backyards, they often get a reputation for raiding those. See this one, I think he's eating a goldfish. That's often what they're fed in captivity as well, as goldfish. But their main prey, again, is amphibians. This one's in the process of eating a wood frog. But one of the cooler things they eat is probably toads. So they do eat a lot of toads. It's one of their favorite prey. And I think I mentioned this before, but toads are actually poisonous. So their skin contains what's called bufotoxin. It's a poison that stops the heart in pretty much any animal that eats it. But garter snakes are immune to it. As again, you can see they don't always swallow their prey head first. I don't know if they have a preference or not. I wonder which is worse for the toad, being swallowed head first or backwards. They will eat salamanders as well. They can also eat newts across the range, which is pretty cool because most newts are super poisonous, far more than toads. There are some newts, I think out west especially, that have enough poison in them to kill multiple people. So the fact that these snakes can eat them, in fact, just live off them exclusively and not die is pretty cool. The toxins that those newts have are called tetrodotoxins. Which if you've ever heard of poisonous pufferfish or fugu, it's the poisonous fish that's used in sushi sometimes. It's like really risky. So, if you eat it, there's a small chance it wasn't prepared right and you die instantly. It's the same family of toxins. And the snakes are able to do that because they have a pretty simple mutation on their sodium channels in the cells of their muscles and nerves. So the tetrodotoxins, they work by pretty much shutting down the nervous system, so it stops your heart and lungs. These snakes just have, I think, one different amino acid on the enzyme that works on their sodium channels in their cells, which neutralizes that poison. Whether eastern garter snakes in Missouri have that same relationship with the central newts that occur here, I don't know, but I'd like to know that. And again, garter snakes do like to eat invertebrates as well. This one is eating a slug. They often eat a lot of earthworms too. It's a pretty important prey item. It's often what they're fed in captivity. It's earthworms and goldfish. I've seen a garter snake regurgitate a big ball of half-digested earthworms, and it was pretty gross. And kind of like I touched on before, a lot of these snakes are pretty easy prey. Garter snakes especially, a lot of things eat garter snakes because they're very common and they're pretty defenseless. They're not venomous, they're not very strong. So as you can see in the pictures on the left, they're actually being swallowed alive by two different kinds of racer snakes. And on the right, there's one that's being eaten by a black-crowned night heron. So yeah, they are a very important source of food for many animals in aquatic habitats like streams. Just like the water snakes that they're related to, the females are considerably larger than the males. As you can see in this picture, I think the larger one is definitely a female. The smaller one is either a male or just a very young one, but it kind of shows the difference in size that you usually see. They give birth live. Same thing with the northern water snakes. They produce a lot of young just because they have a very small chance of survival. That's what the little babies look like. Very adorable. So they often hibernate in groups. That in and of itself is not too unusual. There's a lot of snakes. They'll often gather around really good winter dens. So you might have one given winter den that contains not only multiple individuals of a certain species, but multiple species of snakes. There are some parts of the world where garter snakes are known for really, really huge winter gatherings, especially in parts of Canada, where the red-sided garter snake can gather at different limestone outcrops in the hundreds or thousands. And why they do that is probably because there are a limited number of suitable den sites in these areas. It's also pretty convenient because once they emerge in the spring, that's their mating season. So they don't have to go looking for a mate because they're slithering all over each other. Touching back on these two, I actually took a picture of these at Rockbridge State Park as they were coming out of the same winter den, which in this case was, I think, some sort of animal burrow. This might have been the first day of spring that they had come out of that burrow and basked to kind of warm up. And they will do that probably for a couple days before they will actually leave the area. So they'll just come out in the morning, they'll bask, they'll warm up, they'll get their metabolism going. At night, when it's cold, they'll go back in their den, and they'll just repeat that process until the average daytime temperatures get a little warmer, say probably around mid or late April. Another thing about garter snakes is they seem to be a little more social than other snakes. So there have been actually some experiments done. Captive garter snakes, they seem to actually form something like friendships. So they prefer to hide in certain shelters where their buddies are. They seem to form little partnerships. I have seen garter snakes in my old backyard in St. Louis that were using the same few square feet of each other. And when you disturb them, they'd all slither into the same hole. So there probably is some amount of communal denning or just a lot of social tolerance for each other. But yeah, not all reptiles are necessarily as reptilian and cold as we think. Just like the water snakes, they will release musk if you disturb them and defecate. Smaller individuals generally aren't too aggressive if you try to mess with them. The large ones, especially adult females, they will readily bite And again, sometimes that causes some swelling, but usually doesn't. All right, so the next one is the western ribbon snake. This one is really closely related to garter snakes. You probably consider it a type of garter snake. It's in the same genus, Thamnophis. The only real difference is that they're much, much more slender and sleek than garter snakes. You can kind of see that in this picture. They also occur statewide, and they tend to prefer areas with water, streams. I often find them near wetlands, especially around Eagle Bluffs here in Columbia. They're pretty common on the Katy Trail. And that's mostly just because that's where their prey is, just like garter snakes. They eat a lot of amphibians. And you can really see how slender they are in this picture. I believe that's why they're called ribbon snakes, is just because they're colorful and very skinny. As I've said, they're very thin. They're not very long. They're usually only 1 or 2 feet, maybe 3 at most. They have a pretty similar color scheme as garter snakes, but it's not nearly as variable. It's just a very solid black color with 3 light stripes. The difference is that their central stripe, the one down the spine, is generally a different color than the side ones. It tends to be a much darker, richer orange color than just yellow. They do have a white spot on their head, so you can see in these 2 pictures. Diet, pretty similar to garter snakes. They eat a lot of amphibians, especially tadpoles. They are somewhat limited in the size of prey that they can consume just because they're so skinny. They can't take on something like an adult bullfrog. They eat a lot of tadpoles, small fish sometimes, and again, they swallow them alive. Just like garter snakes and water snakes, which they're again related to, they give birth live. They can't have as many offspring though, just because their body cavity is so small and limited. They can usually only have 1 or 2 dozen babies instead of 30 or 60. And they give birth in the summer, which I probably should have mentioned before. Yeah, most snakes they generally give birth August, sometimes late July or September, and that's also around the time when snake eggs start hatching as well, is late summer. It's just another one I found a few years ago. Very cute snakes. All right, so now we're kind of going to transition a little bit. So first 3 we talked about were snakes that are getting most of their prey directly from aquatic ecosystems. That's where they're spending the majority of their time. They could probably consider them semi-aquatic. The next few species we're going to talk about, they're also non-venomous, but they're more terrestrial in nature. So they're not going to be foraging in the water, but more next to the water in those bottomland habitats. So first 2 are actually combined just because they're very closely related and they're very similar ecologically in an appearance. That would be the brown snake and the red-bellied snake. They both occur in the same kind of habitats, moist wooded areas. It's often near streams because those areas maintain the most soil moisture. And it's very important for these guys because they spend a lot of time underground or in the leaf litter. They eat invertebrates that like those kinds of damp habitats, and we'll get into that a little bit. And they're also kind of at risk of drying out, actually, because they're so small. So if these things were out and about in a really hot area in the middle of summer, they might actually die. So they need to be in pretty cool, moist habitats, and that's often near small streams and wooded areas, or sometimes even bottomlands. I found them on stream banks on the Missouri River, actually. Very, very small. They're the smallest snake we're going to talk about. They're generally less than 1 foot long. Brown snakes are a little larger than red bellies. Often when people see them, they think they're baby snakes, but they're adults. They just don't get big. And there's actually a lot of snakes like that, both in Missouri and worldwide. They're very small, and they just kind of spend most of their life underground or under leaf litter, eating little invertebrates, kind of like a lizard or a frog. Not what most people think of when they think of snakes. So the brown snake, it's brown. Surprise, surprise. It's usually got some black and white markings kind of speckled all over its body. Sometimes it kind of looks like it has double row of little spots. It's pretty faint. They're often mistaken for baby copperheads. I've had multiple people on hiking trails, the Katy Trail, they walk by and I saw some baby copperheads, look out. Like, oh, that's cool. I've seen 15 brown snakes. Well, that's probably what they're seeing. The red-bellied snake looks a little similar, but there are some differences. They come in some different colors, so sometimes they're steely gray, like the one on the bottom. Sometimes they're kind of mocha latte colored, like the one on top, or anything in between. And instead of spots, they generally have 4 very faint stripes down the entire length of their body, kind of like a garter snake, but dark instead of light, and there's 4 of them instead of 3. And they generally have some sort of marking on their neck, either a series of small spots or they're fused to form one large spot, kind of like a collar. That makes them look a bit like another snake called the ringneck snake, which we're not really going to talk about when we have time, but there are some differences. And obviously the red-bellied snake has a red belly. Sometimes it's kind of pink, sometimes it's kind of orange. If you disturb them, sometimes they'll flip over and show their belly to try and warn you away from eating them. So I talked about this a little already. They like hiding in moist soil environments, places with lots of leaf litter, under damp, rotting logs, just areas that are very cool and have a lot of moisture. So normally that's either going to be a very well-forested, north-facing slope, or it's going to be an area of very low elevation near a waterway of some sort. They also like cooler weather in general. In the middle of summer, or really summer in general, you're probably not going to find them on the surface, at least during the day. But you can find them pretty late or early in the year. I found these guys in November, and I've seen them slithering around in early March as well. So they're a pretty cool weather snake. They eat soft invertebrates mainly. Both of them have a reputation for eating snails. I wish I had a video of it, but I don't. They actually pull snails out of their shells and eat them. They'll also eat slugs. Sometimes they'll eat worms and soft-bodied insect larvae like beetle larvae. And sometimes they do swim, but it's pretty rare. I managed to get the picture on the bottom, also at Rockbridge State Park pretty early in the year. I don't know if he was foraging in the water, if he was just getting from point A to point B, but it's pretty cool to see him because you don't usually see them swimming. But pretty much all snakes can swim if they have to. And just like the garter snakes and water snakes and ribbon snakes that they're related to, they give live birth. All snakes in the subfamily Natricinae, in North America anyway, give live birth. That's just a feature of them. They can give birth to a surprisingly high number of babies, given that they're so small. I think a foot-long snake could manage to store a dozen 3-inch long snakes in it, but somehow they managed to pull that off. And as you can see on the bottom picture, they're utterly adorable. They have big heads and big bulgy eyes, just like any other baby animal. And because they're so small, they're obviously prey for pretty much anything. Even songbirds will catch little babies sometimes and feed them to their young. Things like blue jays, crows, turkeys will readily eat these little guys. They can't really do anything. If they're found, they're pretty much defenseless. They don't bite people if you try to pick them up, but probably shouldn't try anyway. Sometimes, especially brown snakes, they will kind of coil into a striking position like any other snake, and sometimes they'll strike at you, but they do it with their mouth closed. And even if they tried to bite, their teeth are so short and minuscule, and their jaws are so small they can't even break the skin. And red-bellied snakes, they sometimes play dead. They roll over on their back, they become unresponsive, and they show that bright red belly. Right. So the next snake we're going to talk about, it's not a natricine like the first 4. It's actually an egg layer. It's one of my favorite snakes. I think they're beautiful. It's actually the first snake I have any memory of ever seeing. It was probably 4 or 5. Family was hiking at the Pond State Park. My father almost stepped on one accidentally, and my sister pointed it out. Yeah, beautiful green scales. They're pretty much the only green snake in Missouri. There used to be another species in the prairies of northern Missouri called the smooth green snake, which had smooth scales, but that hasn't been seen in Missouri for decades, probably due to lack of prairie habitat nowadays. And as you can tell from the name, they have a rough skin texture. Their scales are keeled slightly. They're pretty unmistakable. The only green snake in Missouri, really. If you see a snake that's bright green, it's this one. They also have a little wash of yellow along their sides. They're not very big. They're very, very slender, too. They're generally 2 feet or less. You can see this one in my hand for scale. That's my finger. I have pretty small fingers, so that guy's probably not much thicker than a pencil. And they don't get much bigger than that. Just another picture. You can see the little bit of yellow on the underside. They have very big eyes, too. I imagine they're visual predators, so they probably have better vision than some snakes. So they're very good climbers. They are pretty arboreal. They spend most of their time above ground, climbing around in shrubbery. Often that's near stream banks. They'll climb around in things like willows and ironwoods, blackberries, often vegetation that grows near streams. Sometimes they'll rest in vegetation like this. They'll just kind of sit and hang there, chill out. Sometimes you can find them on the ground, crossing trails and things. They're just kind of getting from point A to point B. I found they're pretty slow. They're not as fast as some other snakes on the ground, and they kind of have a stiff way about them. They don't seem to be quite as flexible or liquid in their movement. And again, often they're near streams. I think once or twice I found one. It tried to get away from me. It actually jumped in the water, tried to swim away a bit and hide in a stream bank. And they are actually insectivorous, so they're eating insects and spiders. This one, I think, managed to eat a dragonfly. Usually they're eating things like crickets, which is what they're often fed in captivity, as well as grasshoppers, fishing spiders. But one of their favorite foods is really soft-bodied caterpillars. So they eat a lot of those. They're not venomous, obviously. They don't constrict the bugs. They just grab them and swallow them whole. They are egg layers, so they're the first egg-laying species that we've had on this list. They lay their eggs at some point in summer after mating in spring. And those eggs generally hatch kind of late in the summer. They don't really have much defense beyond camouflage. So they're kind of banking on that, just not being found. If they do, there's not really a whole lot they can do. They're so small, they can't really bite anything, even if they tried, which they almost never do. They're very, very docile snakes. So this is a little juvenile. I guess he's been irritated enough to the point where he's opening his mouth, but normally they don't really do that. Cute little baby. And there's just another picture of one I found at Runge Nature Center. Bright green scales, big eye. All right, so the western rat snake, it's more often known as the black rat snake. That used to be its official name, but there were some taxonomical changes in the rat snakes. So they gave it a new genus as well as a new common name, which they generally do when things are assigned different scientific names. So now it's called the western rat snake. It's not as descriptive, but it is what it is. Was in the genus Elaphase, which included some European rat snakes, but then genetic evidence found that they were more closely related to other snakes in North America instead of snakes in the Old World, which I guess is not that surprising. Like all the other snakes, they're pretty much found statewide. Almost any wooded habitat, but they seem to like kind of riparian forests, especially in northern Missouri, where those are the main forests that there are. It's best forest habitat in agricultural areas. Obviously, they're black. They generally have kind of white lips. Their underside is white with black spots. See, kind of there's pictures for scale. As you can see, they're pretty heavy-bodied. They're very muscular snakes, and they can get pretty long. So they're one of the largest snakes we have in Missouri. That's me in the picture on the left, and I'm about 5'11", so that snake is at least 5 feet long, maybe 6. I think the record in Missouri was 7 feet, and the world record was about a little over 8 feet. So they're pretty big snakes, and when they get that size, they really don't have much to fear from predators. Sometimes things like red-tailed hawks and great horned owls will try and catch them, but I've heard stories and even pictures of these birds that end up they're biting off more than they can chew, and the snake gets some coils around them, and either the bird dies, the snake gets away, or they both die. But yeah, they can strangle large raptors to death if the raptors try to mess with them. Just not that surprising because 5, 6, 7 foot snake is probably weighing as much or more as a 3-pound hawk. So this is what the juveniles look like. So with many snakes, annoyingly, the juveniles look nothing like the adults. So if you only memorize what adults look like, you'll be out of luck. So the juveniles are actually spotted, which is pretty typical for when snakes have this color change. The juveniles are often the spotted ones, and then they become monochromatic as they gain pigment and become just darker and more drab. So yeah, the little guys are kind of pale or gray or cream colored with really dark spots. And actually, if you want to go back, you can actually see some trace of that pattern in the adults, especially the picture on the right. So adults often retain some degree of faint spotting pattern, kind of a holdover from their baby years. And that varies in degree from snake to snake. Some are jet black like this guy. Some are very visibly spotted, to the point where they don't even look like black rat snakes anymore. And they often have a lot of orange pigment between their scales too, which confuses things. The picture of the snake that my sister found caught in mesh years ago that I talked about, I didn't know what it was because it was a really weird colored rat snake. It wasn't very black. It just had a lot of orange pigmentation and it had a lot of that spotting on it. So it just didn't look like a rat snake to her. Just like the green snakes, they are arboreal. They're probably the best climbers of Missouri snakes. And they do that because, one, they're really, really muscular. They're constrictors, so they got a lot of muscle to heave themselves up. They also have more vertebrae than many other snakes their size, so they're very bendy and flexible. They can kind of move themselves in the directions that they need to and extend their body and reach faraway branches. And they also have hardened belly scales. They're more firm, so they can grip on tree bark and climb their way up. So you can see this one's doing. If you look at both of these pretty close, you can actually see the trace of spotting pattern I talked about. And again, they can climb straight up a tree, which most snakes have some difficulty doing, but yeah, that's what they're good at. And that helps them access a lot of different prey items. So mainly these guys are going after warm-blooded prey. They prefer birds, bird nestlings, bird eggs, as well as various mammals. Things like rats, mice, chipmunks, small squirrels, sometimes small rabbits, even bats. I've heard stories from bat biologists of a black rat snake that was camping outside of a cave and was making a living eating gray bats as they came out. So yeah, they're often known for raiding bird boxes, you can see in this picture. Just because they're such good climbers, they can get resources that other snakes necessarily can't. You can see this one's actually swallowed an egg. And you can see the distended neck. You can see the skin in between the scales. So snakes do actually have skin under their scales, just like any other animal. And again, they are constricting snakes. So they're the first constrictor that we talked about. They're actually the only constrictor we're going to talk about in detail. So they just wrap their body around their prey items and squeeze it. And often what happens, at least with the strongest constrictors, is that it actually stops the blood flow. It doesn't necessarily suffocate the prey, but it actually squeezes so hard that their heart can't literally pump blood through their veins. And they are egg layers, so it's a little egg. They generally have 24 or so. Because they're so big, they can have pretty large offspring, so they're coming out of the egg already at about a foot long. When they're disturbed, they generally do the same series of behaviors. So if it first notices a threat, it'll kind of stretch itself out and it'll form these little kinks with its body. It's just kind of assessing what's going on. Like, hey, I don't know you, what you doing? If you get a little closer, or if it thinks you're more of a serious threat, it'll form a more classic striking position. And these guys can be pretty bad-tempered, so they can be pretty kind of aggressive. They'd be pretty loud. They'll strike at you repeatedly. If you try and pick them up, they will bite. And since they're pretty big, they can inflict a pretty painful bite for a snake, but really most snake bites aren't that bad just because their jaws aren't very strong and their teeth are just little tiny needles, so it just feels like pinpricks. Their temperament kind of varies from individual to individual, I found. That might be in part due to temperature. So if you find a cold snake, it might be a little more docile. And I've found some rat snakes that were very, very gentle and easygoing. Just pick them up. They didn't seem to care. And there were others that would just thrash around and try to bite you like they were dying. So behavior is pretty variable. All right. This next one is the eastern hognose snake. These are pretty cool snakes. They're pretty unique. Pretty much statewide distribution. They're not very picky about habitat. Pretty much anywhere that has amphibians and loose soil from the Berwyn, they will occur. But that often means that they're found in really sandy floodplain areas. They're not very long, but they're pretty fat, very stocky, and they're slow moving. And they look a lot like vipers. So the most distinctive trait about these guys is obviously the shape of their rostrum. So the scale on the tip of their nose, it's kind of shaped upturned in a way. It kind of makes them look like a pig, a little pig nose. And they do actually use that for rooting around. They're pretty variable in color pattern. The only constants really are that hook-nosed and the fact that they have two dark spots behind their head on their neck. As I said before, these guys are really, really variable in their color and their pattern. So they can occur in just solid black or gray. They can be kind of red or orange. They can be any shade of brown there is under the sun. They can have varying degrees of spots. They can be not spotted. They can be faintly spotted. They can be very spotted. It's just really, really variable. Probably both geographically and even within populations. I've found snakes that look like 2 or 3 of these individuals in the exact same spot. So even within a population, there's a lot of genetic diversity there as far as color goes. So they have their blondes, brunettes, and redheads. This is what they look like swimming. They generally don't forage much in the water, even though they eat amphibians, but that's what that looks like. All snakes swim. Like I said before, they use their rostrum, their nose, for kind of rooting around, and they do that to find amphibians, mainly toads that are kind of buried in the dirt. Toads will often do that, especially during hot, dry weather, to kind of stay moist. So they'll dig around and look for those. And they're actually immune to toad poison, just like garter snakes. I believe they do it in a slightly different way, though. They have really huge adrenal glands in their neck, if you can call it a neck. And what those do, and they're like 10 times the size of the adrenal glands in other snakes, but what those do is they produce huge amounts of adrenaline. So when they eat a toad and they're ingesting those bufotoxins that want to stop their heart, it's kind of like those big adrenaline injections that people sometimes get to restart their hearts. So they just produce that in their own body to keep their heart going as they're eating and digesting that toad. What's really cool about these guys is that they're also, like the garter snakes, they're kind of venomous, but not really. So they have what's called a Duvernois gland in their head. It's kind of like a really rudimentary, simple version of a venom gland. And they do have enlarged teeth at the rear of their skull. There's actually a lot of non-venomous snakes in the family Colubridae, which is where most non-venomous snakes are placed, that have these features. They have either mildly or occasionally dangerously venomous venom and enlarged teeth at the hind part of their skull. And the hognose snakes are mainly just using that to immobilize the toads they're eating, because toads, when they're attacked, they will puff up and they'll try and make themselves larger so that the snake can't swallow them. Well, if they're paralyzed, they're going to have to kind of loosen themselves and they'll relax and let themselves be eaten. And yeah, they're just delivering that mildly neurotoxic saliva with those enlarged hind teeth that they can inject into the toad. Pretty cool. But again, they're not really dangerous to people. The saliva is not toxic. And you can see there's another one, a very young individual. He's in the process of eating a toad. And there's a little cute baby. Right. Yeah. So usually the babies are a little more brightly colored than the adults, as is the norm with snakes. So when they're agitated, they often do the same sort of things that other snakes do. They try to puff up to make themselves look larger. But since they're already very stocky looking in physique, they do look a lot like vipers, especially when they puff up their necks. So they can actually extend the nuchal ribs in their neck, a lot like a cobra can, just to look much bigger than they really are. And they'll swell up their bodies, and they will hiss really, really loudly, and it's intimidating. And they will actually strike with their mouth closed, and we actually have a video of that. Pretty cool. So they look pretty scary, but they're pretty much just putting on a show. When it comes down to it, they're pretty easygoing. If you do kind of bother them beyond that, they will actually play dead and they'll play possum. They'll roll onto their back. They'll release this nasty musk that makes them smell like death, and they'll just pretend to be dead. No matter how much you poke at them, or if you roll them over right side, they'll just roll back on their back and play dead. They're just really not aggressive snakes. They almost never bite people. Even when they strike, they generally do it with their mouth closed. So, as scary as they seem, they're not dangerous. Oops. Sure. That picture go away. We'll pick up the pace. So there's a couple other snakes I just want to talk about quickly. Speckled king snake. They're very pretty snakes. They often eat other snakes. One of my favorites. Eastern yellow-bellied racer. Again, they often eat other snakes, pretty much anything. In Missouri, people call them blue racers. That's what their babies look like. They're spotted. And like I said before, there's lots of other different water snake species, in addition to northern water snakes that occur in Missouri. So there's yellow-bellied water snake, which have yellow bellies. There's the blotched water snake, which is a subspecies, which just retains its baby spots. And that occurs in western Missouri, whereas the yellow-bellied water snake occurs in the southeast. There's the diamondback water snake. It has a distinctive chain-like pattern that occurs throughout Missouri, except the Ozarks. Broad-banded, very pretty, only occurs in the boot heel. And then there's the Graham's crayfish snake, which is actually a crayfish specialist. As you saw in the picture before, they actually eat crayfish, which is pretty weird. Mostly they go after freshly molted crayfish that still have a soft exoskeleton. All right, so now we're going to go talk about the venomous snakes that occur in around Missouri streams and rivers. Trying to go as fast as I can. So first, the copperhead. Everyone's heard of copperheads. They are a viper, the family Viperidae. They are the most common venomous snake in most of the eastern U.S. They occur almost statewide in Missouri, with the exception of some northern counties in Iowa, near Iowa. Not too big, generally 2, maybe 3 feet long, and they have a very stocky build like most pit vipers. They're called copperheads, obviously, because their head is kind of a coppery brownish orange color. And sometimes they're a little paler, sometimes they're a little darker, as you can see in these two pictures. I think the darker ones are generally more northern populations, but they have the same color pattern. It's pretty distinctive. They have very small number of these very wide blotches, or I don't know if you'd call them spots or bands, and they're a pretty distinctive shape too. They're kind of shaped like an hourglass if you look at them from the top, and usually they meet in the middle. The juveniles, they look pretty much identical, except they have a bright yellow tail, and they actually do what's called caudal luring. It's where they'll wiggle their tail around and try to attract prey. You can find these pretty much any wooded area, but they're often found near stream banks or lowland forests. As far as prey goes, they'll eat pretty much anything. They often eat rodents, but will also eat lizards and insects, like this one's eating a cicada. The juveniles often eat frogs, and that's what they lure in with their tail. They're a very, very sedentary snake. They're not very fast, and they spend most of their life within probably an acre or less. So they're just spending most of the day sitting in the same spot doing nothing. And like pretty much all pit vipers, they give birth live. They don't have as many offspring as many of the non-venomous snakes do. It's usually less than a dozen. And that's a common reproductive strategy in pit vipers. Just because they're venomous, they're not as at much risk of predation, so they can afford to have fewer but larger and more well-developed offspring. But it takes quite a toll on the mothers energetically. It takes a lot of energy to make those babies, so they don't do it every year usually. As you can see, they have really great camouflage, and that's what they're relying on most of the time, just to stay hidden. I'm sure we've all walked past dozens of these things and never knew they were there because they blended in so well. If they are found and agitated, what they'll do is they'll tail vibrate. Just like a rattlesnake, they'll actually wiggle their tail back and forth. And there's actually a lot of snakes that do that, venomous and non-venomous. Usually, if there's leaf litter, it'll make kind of a rustling noise that might scare a predator, or it might just distract a predator, a little moving tail. Probably how rattlesnakes evolve their rattles is from that behavior. As far as venom goes, yeah, they are venomous, but they're generally not life-threatening if they bite you. The people at risk are generally children, the elderly, or people with pre-existing health conditions. So they're pretty mild venom, probably the most mild venom of any North American snake. If you just had to get bit by a venomous snake in the US, it better be this one. That said, if you do get bitten, you should still seek medical attention immediately, because it can cause some localized tissue death, and that can cause some secondary infections as well. So you need to go to a hospital, get anti-venom if they have it, or at least antibiotics, which they will usually give you to prevent any infections of the blood. Because what most pit vipers' venom do is they actually break down cells, they break down blood vessels, they cause internal bleeding, and they kind of pre-digest their prey, kind of liquefies the organs before they eat it. So when they bite a person, there is some cell damage inside internally. So it'll ruin your day. There's a short video of the copperhead. I just wanted to show the tail vibrating behavior. There you go. So yeah, just like a rattlesnake, they'll wiggle their tail around even though they don't have a rattle. And a lot of non-venomous snakes will do that as well. All right, cottonmouth. So cottonmouth is another viper. It's closely related to copperheads in the same genus. They can actually hybridize, at least in captivity. They're mostly a southeastern snake. They're more associated with like the deep south, but they do actually occur in Missouri. It's kind of the northwestern extent of their distribution. It's kind of the Missouri Ozarks. That said, the Ozarks aren't great habitat for them. So they're generally kind of rare. They occur sporadically, not nearly as common as they are in places like Louisiana or Florida, where they're just everywhere. Like vipers, they're pretty stocky. They're fat. They're not very fast. The western cottonmouth, which is a subspecies that occurs in Missouri, it's often very drab in coloration. It has a lot of pigment. It's almost black in color sometimes. There's not a whole lot of pattern there. However, sometimes there is a little trace amount of pattern from when they're younger. So sometimes there's some subtle banding there. It almost looks like a copperhead that was dipped in chocolate. One of the more distinctive features about them is kind of towards their head. So their lips are usually kind of white, kind of some white, almost looks like makeup around their lips. And there's usually kind of a dark stripe just above that going behind the eye. They're called cottonmouths because of kind of a defensive behavior they do. So when they're irritated, when they're ticked off, they will kind of just open their mouth and hang it there defensively as a display. And the flesh of their mouth is kind of cotton white. So that's how they get the name. So most other snakes, they don't necessarily do that. They won't just gape at you for a minute. Just like many other snakes, the juveniles don't look much like the adults. So their babies are very boldly patterned. See on the left, I think that's a newborn. They also have the yellow tail tips, just like copperheads, and they use them the same way to attract prey. The one on the right is probably a little older, maybe a year or so. But as they get older, they produce more and more pigment, and that really obscures their pattern in most individuals. So like I said before, they normally occur in backwaters, places like swamps, sloughs, oxbow lakes. But in the Ozarks, they do actually occur in streams, but because that's kind of on the periphery of their distribution, they're not as common there, which is pretty typical for animals that kind of living in suboptimal habitats. They're not as common in those habitats because it's just not as good habitat for them. But they do eke out a living in Ozark streams. Another thing, they're not as good swimmers as water snakes, despite being called water moccasins. They don't dive as readily. They will dive if you irritate them enough, but they generally don't forage around underwater like water snakes do. And when they're swimming on the surface, most of their body is held above the water, and their head is held up well above the water, as you can see in these two pictures. And they're much slower, kind of clumsier swimmers compared to a lot of the water snakes. As far as their diet goes, they will eat pretty much anything, and their venom allows them to do that because they just have to bite it and it's dead. So they will eat fish that they can catch in the shallows. They will eat other vertebrates like lizards, mice. As I said towards the beginning, they will even eat other snakes. So this one is eating a yellow-bellied water snake. Sometimes they'll even eat baby alligators. So this picture is pretty cool, because I think most herpetologists would probably say that never happens because their cottonmouths are known for cannibalism. But this picture was actually taken in early spring when these guys were coming out of, it's not quite hibernation, but brumation. So it's just a big pile of cottonmouths, and I didn't know they did that until I found this picture. But yeah, it's pretty interesting. There's more than a dozen snakes there. Just like the copperhead and other pit vipers, they give live birth. Just like copperheads, they don't have many. And the males actually do this pretty interesting behavior where they try and wrestle each other, especially during the breeding season or if there's a female nearby. So cottonmouths are dangerously venomous. They're much more potent than copperheads. Just like copperheads, they will do that tail vibrating behavior. And like I said, they'll open their mouths. Generally, if you irritate them, they'll do what this one's doing. They'll coil up. They'll kind of look at you, raise its head. Keep bothering it, it's going to open its mouth and gape at you. And if you keep persisting and annoying it, it's going to eventually strike. But most of them are fairly reluctant to strike. You really have to either step directly on them or you're fiddling with them and trying to pick them up and just asking to be bitten. So a lot of people, they confuse northern water snakes with cottonmouths, even in states that don't have cottonmouths. Pretty much just any snake near the water, people assume is a cottonmouth. They freak out, and sometimes they try to kill it. There are a lot of key differences. First off, you're looking at the head. Being pit vipers, cottonmouths have these vertical pupils, whereas water snakes and other colubrids, they have round pupils. It's not that useful since you have to be sticking your face in the snake's face, but yeah. Water snake lips, they tend to be striped, whereas cottonmouth's lips, they tend to be pure white. Cottonmouths, again, they also have that stripe behind their eye. As far as swimming goes, water snakes often have much or all of their body beneath the water, and sometimes they'll do this little periscoping behavior, where they'll just kind of stick their head up out of the water to see what's going on, see if you're still there, and then they'll swim away. Whereas, again, the cottonmouths are going to hold their head up above the water, and they're going to keep most of their body elevated. This water snake is much lower down in the water. Yeah, you see the back here on that water snake, it's totally submerged, whereas in the cottonmouth, it's held mostly above water. I wonder if they're just more buoyant. There's only 3 or 4 other venomous snakes in Missouri. They're all rattlesnakes. Timber rattlesnake's the big one. The Massasauga is really rare. There's only a few wet prairies or wetland areas where it still occurs in Missouri. The pygmy rattlesnake mostly just occurs deep in the Ozarks, mostly on glades. It's pretty inconspicuous. None of the 3 of these are nearly as common as copperheads or cottonmouths. Venomous snake bites in Missouri, in general, there's not that many. It's usually less than 100 in any given year. Snake bite fatalities nationwide in a given year, as you can see in this little chart, they're usually in the single digits. Decades ago, that used to be higher, but advances in things like anti-venom and hospital care in general have just really lowered that fatality rate. And given that I think 6, 7, 8,000 people are bitten by venomous snakes a year, the fact that only 5 actually die, that's a pretty small minority. That said, there have been some fatalities within Missouri from the 2 species I talked about. And that's out of only, I think, 5 recorded deaths in Missouri. The last 3 have happened in the last decade, actually. So in 2012, a man was bit by a copperhead in his tent on the Current River. He's trying to get out of his tent, was bitten on the finger. The next day, he had a heart attack while he was in the hospital and died. 2014, there was a man at Sam A. Baker State Park who actually saw a copperhead outside of his cabin and decided to pick it up and got bit. And he actually had an allergic reaction to it, went into anaphylactic shock. So his immune response overreacted, kind of the same way like if you get stung by a bee, if you're allergic to bee stings. And that allergic reaction is ultimately what led to his death, unfortunately, the next day. And then in 2015, I guess I should say, allergic reactions to snake venom do happen sometimes, but they generally don't. And then in 2015, there was a man who was supposedly bitten by a cottonmouth while he was wading the James River down in southwest Missouri, bitten on both of his legs. Instead of going to the hospital, as he should have, he just kind of went home and apparently self-medicated, both with alcohol and painkillers. And yeah, he was found dead the next day. So good lessons there. If you see a snake, don't pick it up, especially if it's a copperhead and you know it's a copperhead or any other venomous snake. Second, if you do get bit by a snake, go to the hospital. You can't sleep it off. You can't just take painkillers. You shouldn't try to suck the venom out. That does not work. That's a myth. Just go to the hospital. Healthcare is good. All right, here's just a comparison. It's a little quiz for you. There's a cottonmouth, there's a copperhead, and a northern water snake picture all here. So I just thought it'd be kind of fun for you to pick out which is which, see how much you learned or how much you already knew. I'll give you a few seconds. We're almost done, don't worry. All right. So the guy on the left is a northern water snake. So you can see he's swimming, most of his body's submerged. He has a lot of very visible bands. The copperhead, top right, those hourglass-shaped markings. They're very large. There's not many of them. It's got that tan beige coloration. And then the cottonmouth on the bottom, fat, stocky. It's very obscure pattern. Not quite as dark as some of them, but still pretty dark. Here's another one, just comparing cottonmouths and water snakes, seeing if you can pick out which is which. Give you a few seconds. All right. So the little guy that's really heavily banded on the bottom, that's actually a baby cottonmouth. So like I said, they are more vividly colored than the adults. And you can kind of see he's got that little yellow tail tip. The one on the top, cottonmouth. He's holding his head well above the water. He's swimming with most of his body above water as well. And the guy on the bottom left is also a cottonmouth. So he kind of has those pale lips. I kind of see a dark stripe behind his eye, but it's pretty obscure because he's so dark in general. But that's another distinguishing feature, is all of that dark pigmentation. Generally, water snakes aren't that dark. And guy on the top left, that is the northern water snake. You can see it has that distinctive coloration, the saddles on the neck, the blotches on the back, and those bars along its flanks. You can kind of see its round pupil. What about here? Do you guys see any water moccasins? Do any of them look venomous? In case you said yes, the answer is actually no. So this guy probably looks the most like a cottonmouth. Is actually a yellow-bellied water snake, which occur in kind of southeastern, far eastern Missouri. There are a lot of things about him that look like a cottonmouth. It was really, really dark. He doesn't have too much pattern to him. Kind of looks like he has white lips, but they are actually yellow. His whole underbelly is yellow. And if you look closely, you can see that his lip scales are kind of striped in between each scale. And that's a feature specific to water snakes, or at least non-venomous snakes. But what he's doing is he's puffing up and he's trying to look big, and that makes him look a lot more dangerous than he really is, and it makes him look venomous, which he is not. So the little guy on the bottom left, that's actually the crayfish snake. They're pretty distinctive. They really don't look anything like cottonmouths, if you know what cottonmouths look like. Just two-toned, small, conspicuous. Bottom right's the diamondback water snake. And then top right is just another northern water snake, as hopefully you figured out. All right. Like I said before, a lot of people confuse brown snakes with copperheads, or baby copperheads, because they're so small. They really don't look that much alike side by side. Hopefully you can guess which one is which. Are there any guesses, Amy?
No, our audience is pretty quiet tonight.
No. That's okay. Well, the one on the left is actually the copperhead.
Oh, that one did come in just as you said it. Yes.
All right. You got it right. So yeah, side by side, they really don't look anything alike. The copperheads have these really wide bands and the yellow tail tip when they're young. Brown snakes, pretty drab. They don't really have bands at all, but often they do get killed just because people think they're baby copperheads, but totally unnecessary. He looks a lot meaner than he really is just because he's trying to open his mouth and look scary just because someone's close to him and he doesn't like it. They do look like Hershey's Kisses. Yeah, from the side, they're very triangular. Do you think any of these snakes are venomous? Or any of them copperheads? None of them are rattlesnakes because we didn't go over those. Yes, no, maybe.
Is the one in the upper right, is that a hognose?
Upper right?
Yeah, upper right.
It's actually a baby racer.
Oh,
But we didn't really go over that.
darn.
Nope, there are no venomous snakes in this picture. Two of them we didn't really go over much or at all. The top left is actually a prairie king snake. We didn't cover that one just because it's more of a prairie snake. A lot of people confuse them as copperheads and kill them. I heard a story not that long ago about a guy that did that. And really all these snakes on here are often confused with copperheads as well. So baby racers, hognose snakes, and the juvenile water snakes as well. Just because they're brown and they have bands, people think they're copperheads. All right, what about here? It's 4 snakes. Is any of them a copperhead?
Lower left.
Anyone else? Yeah, it's the lower left.
All right.
So when they're side by side, I mean, they really look pretty distinctive, but again, all of these snakes are sometimes confused with copperheads. Upper left is a milk snake. Considering they're red, I don't know how people mistake them for copperheads, but they do sometimes. Upper right, that's a juvenile black rat snake, which you talked about. The bottom right is actually a juvenile prairie king snake. Probably looks the most copperhead-like out of all of them, but it's much more spotted. Right. This is the last slide. Anyone know what these are? We did go over them.
I'm going to say ribbon snakes.
Yeah, Kim got it right. So the left one is a red-bellied snake. So you can kind of see the really faint dark stripes running down its body, and you can just barely see the little light spot behind its head. And then the snake on the right is an eastern garter snake. So it's got the three yellow stripes and then that kind of checkerboard pattern in between. Yeah, I just put that picture in there because it's hard to find snake comparisons in one picture. I like the picture. Hopefully you learned something.
Evidently, I have a lot more to learn.
I mean, it's easy for me because I've been staring at snake guides for 20 years, so takes time. Yeah, thank you everyone for watching. That's the end of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Sam. And yeah, thank you to everyone who joined us tonight and stuck us out all the way through. Yeah, wow, really great information.
We do have a question that came in on the Q&A.
Oh, okay, yeah. If there's Q&A, let's...
What should you do with a copperhead around your deck/patio? Should we worry with kids and pets?
Yeah, so you don't want to leave that there. I think generally animal control companies will come and deal with those. She's usually best. If you utterly have to do it, to get rid of it yourself, I'd say the best way is like to try and coax it with a very long stick into a large, thick plastic bucket. I know some people do that, and just try and take the snake far away, take the lid off, and just kind of knock the bucket over with the long stick, let the snake slither out. Some people resort to killing them. I won't argue not to do that if it's in your home, but I would definitely advise not doing that out in nature. Just leave them be. They'll leave you be. Hopefully that answers your question. Spraying it with the hose will make it go away, yeah. It won't go very far.
All right, excellent. So thank you again, everyone, and thank you, Sam. This was great. Again, this is recorded, so for anybody who had friends or family that wanted to join in that couldn't tonight, I will be posting this on our YouTube page tomorrow. So just search for Missouri Stream Team on YouTube, and this will be available. And make sure to join us in a couple weeks on a turtle presentation, also from Sam. So again, thank you, Sam, for sharing your expertise. It was very interesting and very entertaining. We really appreciate the time that you've taken to help educate us on snakes and Missouri streams. So with that, I'm going to stop recording, but if there's any more chat,